Hi everybody, David here. Good afternoon. This is the third of our video series in our course, American Entrepreneurship Since 1900. And my term paper was on the question of why would FDR take the United States off of the gold standard during the Great Depression. So for me, this was kind of personal. I've always been fascinated with which of our currencies are based on fiat, gold, or silver. And when my son, who's a college student, was in the middle schools, he knew that I was a collector of silver certificates. I have a couple of ones, I have a 5, I have a 10, nothing extravagant. But he got me this one because someone tried to pay him for something and he recognized immediately it's a silver certificate. And it started me wondering why, how. Why do we switch off gold? Why do we switch to silver? Why do we switch off silver to the fiat system we have today? When FDR assumes the presidency in 33, we're in the middle of a massive bank run in the United States. There had been the collapse of the economy starting in 29 with the stock market crash that everybody knows about. But most people were not directly affected by that. And then in 1930 and 1931, there's runs on the bank. And that's people running to get their cash out, and that's quelled. The Federal Reserve was able to manage some of that. But as FDR is president-elect, but not actually president yet in the fall of 32, he's asked about, are you going to devalue the dollar? And FDR being FDR was vague enough that he actually caused a panic that 4 weeks before he became president, in the state of Michigan, they decided to have a bank holiday to halt the massive withdrawals of funds, and it caused a panic. So when FDR becomes president 4 weeks later, the state of New York, the Fed chairman of the state of New York's Fed Reserve has already instituted a bank holiday, and he's asked the governor to institute a bank holiday, and then the Fed chairman turns to the president and says, you need to do this across the country. The reason for this is by 33, depositors weren't just pulling out paper money. They were pulling out gold. And the Fed Reserve had a mandatory required deposit of 40% in gold, which means that if the bleeding didn't stop, the system was going to collapse upon itself. So FDR really approaches this from two perspectives. The first thing he does is the Emergency Banking Act gives him unbelievable power to do anything he wants with the currency in the United States. This is unheard of levels of power, practically dictatorial. He can print money based on gold. He can print money based on silver. He can print money based on Fed Reserve assets. And it wasn't very clear what that means, Fed Reserve assets, which really means the president could print fiat money if he wanted to at that point. So $2 billion in cash is printed emergency style and immediately pushed back into the banks to help stabilize the banks and avoid people collapsing the entire financial system. There is then the Gold Act, where people were hoarding gold, and FDR says it's illegal for you to possess gold more than $100 of it. I know this is all done to stabilize the economy, but what gets really interesting is that FDR then a year later makes it illegal to possess gold. Even the Treasury can't possess gold. You know, we get the creation of Fort Knox as a depository, and the reason for this is the more gold the president and the government pulls out of the economy by buying it up, the less there is in circulation. This causes the value of the dollar to dip. This means that farmers can now get better prices for their crops because the farmers had been hurting prior to 30, prior to 29 in the crash. Farmers are hurting in the late 20s because they had grown crops to feed Europe during World War I. And when the European market came back on its own, farmers were overburdened in crops. They were overburdened in loans to pay for the expansion. So this was an attempt by the president to help the farmers avoid a complete collapse of individual family farms, which is intrinsically in America part of the West and part of the romanticism of we own our home, we grow our own food, and that was in danger of collapsing. I found it very fascinating that the power of the president to make it illegal for anybody to possess gold comes out of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and that makes sense because that act was instituted to help the farmers. So the sources that I used, I had 43 sources, and it was a balance of primary and secondary. I leaned heavily on the writings of Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke. There were other sources I found. There's a book that I absolutely love about Nixon going off the gold standard, which bookended this, called 3 Days in August. And maybe my favorite thing that I discovered through all this was Ben Bernanke at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, where he talked about it wasn't the factors most history teachers and textbooks talk about that caused the crash, but really that the Federal Reserve, failed to do the thing that it was designed to do. And Bernanke gives this wonderful quote where he says, "We did it, we're sorry, we won't do that again." And he's talking about how the Fed failed to prevent the crash, and that's something I'll get into in a minute in the summation of my findings. I found also using primary sources like New York Times articles of the events that took place, plus FDR's writings, where he didn't just roll out amendments, he actually gave White House announcements of those, and they were very helpful to break down what the president was thinking, or to quote another Nixon era, what did the president know, when did he know it, and follow the money. So the summation of my findings. This paper did not wind up where I thought it was going to, and that was the great joy of the research. I wound up somewhere completely different than I ever imagined I would. I figured FDR had printed more money, so individual depositors, individual consumers could pay off the credit that they had accrued that they owed money on, because everybody was paying with credit. If you were buying a radio, you went, say, to Best Buy and you made a layaway. But Best Buy was buying it from RCA also with credit. So there's credit stacked upon credit during the Great Depression. And so I assumed that's what that purpose was. That's not what it was. First and foremost, as I mentioned, it was to stop the bleeding of the banks and stop the run on the banks. Because the banks were going to run out of cash. And if the banks run out of cash, mortgages collapse. Homeowners become homeless. We would really have a complete collapse of the American economy and America as we know it. That's the first thing I realized. Second thing I realized was going off gold was really to benefit farmers. And I had not even imagined that that's what the focus was, but it was what the farmers had always asked for. There was a bimetallism movement in America that goes back to the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. You know, we're talking Grover Cleveland, we're talking McKinley, we're talking about bimetallism, we're talking about the Cross of Gold speech by William Jennings Bryan. That had been lingering for 50 years, and FDR finally delivers on it for the farmers, because the farmers themselves were in danger of losing the farm. There was this fear that if the farmers lose the farm, people aren't going to starve across America. Corporations are going to overtake farms, and we're going to lose the American identity of the individual farmer. Another thing I realized and picked up on this is why now? The why now moment, and why FDR gets so radicalized. Media. You know, we think of media in our day as multimedia, but it wasn't that. Media in their day was you went to the movies and you spent a whole afternoon in the movies. You know, you'd get a full-length feature film, a couple of shorts, which might be Marx Brothers films, might be Three Stooges films, and you'd get a newsreel. And what would you see on the newsreel? As people are starving because they don't have money for food, you're seeing farmers destroy crops. They're spilling milk. They're plowing things under because they can't afford to bring their own stuff to market. And the federal government knew people were seeing that. Plus, there is no mention of the government doing anything to help black sharecroppers. Black sharecroppers go all the way back to Reconstruction in the United States, which is essentially the beginning of our course when we talked about the postbellum period. Sharecropping black farmers don't own the land. They work on the land of somebody who owns the land. So if the Agricultural Adjustment Act is paying farmers not to grow crops or plow them under, the laborers are being hit even harder. So we're up to 25% of American laborers were out of work. Up to 50% of black laborers were affected by this. Finally, I think the thing I found most fascinating comes out of Milton Friedman's research from the book he wrote in 1963, which is called A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. What I found most fascinating in this book is Friedman contends that the whole thing could have been prevented. The run on the banks, the massive collapse of the economy beyond a normal recession. Friedman refers to the first 3 years of the Great Depression is not the Great Depression, Friedman refers to it as the Great Contraction. Okay, it doesn't become the Great Depression by Friedman's estimates until FDR becomes the president, and things get exponentially worse at that point. Friedman contends that the Federal Reserve could have stopped all this by putting more cash into the economy. And the reason he says it failed to do the job it was originally set up to do under the Wilson administration? Not centralized. The Federal Reserve was not centralized as it is now. It was more isolated into individual banks. And one of the things I teach my students when they start asking me, why did Pearl Harbor happen? Same idea. Every branch of FDR's administration was individualized. There was no centralization of information. This is something we also learn about with 9/11, which is why we have Homeland Security after the fact. When you have individual branches of government and everybody has a piece of something here and there, and they're not sharing it because they're territorial, you don't get a widespread across the United States use of resources to solve great problems. And that's Friedman's argument. The Federal Reserve could have solved this, but they were not united, and they didn't work as one centralized office. Thank you very much. It's been lovely seeing all of you in this course. Hope to see all of you again. Take care.